So hello, I'm Jeff Allen. I'm a cloud solutions architect from Google Cloud, and I'm here also with Rick Dehlinger and Rich Meesters from Citrix, and they're going to be joining us as we get into this presentation. This is CMP 206, Journey to the Cloud Confidently with Citrix and Google Cloud. What we're going to kind of talk about today, one is a demo of our open source project that helps you build Citrix environments on GCP. We're also going to talk about the Citrix Workspace vision, talk about the architectural components of Citrix on GCP, and walk through a number of architectures, including a reference architecture, as well as some examples that we've worked on with customers. So let's dig right into this. We're starting with a demo, which I think it breaks some rules in breakout sessions that you start with a demo. But the reason that we're doing this is we want to show really how quickly and easily you can set up Citrix on GCP, leveraging the open source project we have out on GitHub. And so if we start the scripts at the beginning, we'll be able to come back by the end of the presentation to actually explore this environment that we've built in the course of a breakout session. So we're going to start by looking at this GitHub project we have. It's based on the deployment guide that Citrix authored in 2017, released a sort of reference architecture for how to build Citrix environments on GCP. And we wanted to make it easy to walk through an automated process to build those environments. So we used Deployment Manager, PowerShell scripts to bootstrap the instances. So you can basically take that environment that's described in that document and build it by just kicking off a script from GitHub. All you have to do is clone the GitHub repository, Citrix on GCP, run a script deploy.ps1, that kicks off the deployment manager, and then come back to it. Currently, the latest version of this takes about 22 minutes to deploy an environment, and you've got a working environment to explore. It sets up Notepad as a sample virtual app, but we have a branch that shows you in the project how to customize that if you want to set up additional apps in your Citrix on GCP environment. And then once it's built, you use the Citrix Workspace to access those virtual apps. And we also have a script in there to resize the fleet. It does some rudimentary fleet management. Initially, it builds the virtual fleet with just one instance, but you can run this resize script if you want to add additional capacity. So maybe you're doing a demo, it gets popular, you need some additional capacity for virtual sessions, you can run that resize script to have a larger fleet of workers. And there's a cleanup script that you can run at the end, which tears down all of the GCP resources, and it also cleans up the Citrix cloud resources, because this bootstraps not only the Google environment, but also the Citrix environment. And this cleanup script will tear down both of the environments, so it doesn't leave you with any stranded objects, doesn't leave you with any billing once you're done with the demo. Now, what we're gonna, if you'll switch to the laptop, what we're gonna look at today is actually not in the master branch of our GitHub repository. It's in a branch called experimental, which you're welcome to check out. We've been working on improving the speed of the build and also reworking the architecture a bit to take advantage of some of the newer managed resources. Like when the initial architecture came out, GCP didn't have a managed cloud NAT. We do now, NAT as a service. And so we've been reworking the architecture to take advantage of those newer services. So this experimental branch is sort of the leading edge of where this project is, and it deploys faster and actually more simply leveraging those managed services. So let's take a look. This is the Google Cloud Platform Console. Obviously, we're going to hop into Cloud Shell. And I have, hopefully we're going to hop into Cloud Shell. Okay, so I have this checked out already. So we're going to go to GitHub, Google Cloud Platform, Citrix on GCP, and I'll do a git status. We'll just see that I'm up to date with the experimental branch. Now, there's still a deploy.ps1 script. I'm hopping into PowerShell, by the way. If you're interested in running PowerShell and Cloud Shell, hit me up and I'll show you how to set that up. But all you have to do to set this up is run deploy.ps1. And then give it some parameters, like what domain. This sets up Active Directory as part of the environment that it bootstraps. Active Directory along with all the Citrix configuration. So it's going to set up an Active Directory domain. We're going to say domain, say example.org. Give it a NetBIOS name. We're going to tell it, I'm going to give it a flag called use minimal resources. One of the nice things about this project is that you can use trial accounts both for Google and for Citrix. So you can run this actually for free. And use minimal resources is like a small footprint version that works within the free tier limitations. I'm going to tell it a region. Let's use US West 1. And this is new in the experimental branch. I'm going to tell it Citrix creds for credentials path. This is a JSON file. It's described in the README, but it's a JSON file that has the Citrix client API credentials so that it can connect with the Citrix API and bootstrap the Citrix cloud environment. And so I've created a JSON file and have these loaded in Google Cloud Storage. And so basically, this is all that you need to do to build a Citrix environment on GCP. We'll kick this off, and something's wrong. It's Citrix Cred's URL. There we go. And so we'll see that it's going to initialize a few things, and then very quickly go into Deployment Manager, where Deployment Manager is going to recognize that there's a deployment that's been kicked off. It's an asynchronous operation. It's going to stand up some instances, bootstrap those instances, put a pin in this. We'll come back to it towards the end of our presentation, take a look at what it just built, and actually access that environment, run the virtual app, and see how that works. So now I'm going to, if we'll go back to the slides, I'm going to turn the floor over to Rick Dehlinger, who's going to share with us about the Citrix Workspace vision.
Why, thank you, Jeff. So what'd you think of the interesting start? Kicking off a demo right at the beginning of a session. A little interesting, a little bit of a twist, and perhaps a little cart before the horse. So I'd actually like to start my section here with a couple of questions for you. So for starters, how many of you have heard of or used Citrix technologies before? I see a pretty fair amount of hands. All right, then how many of you have been Citrix customers, used this stuff in production over the years? All right, I'm going to call that probably 30% maybe, somewhere along those lines. All right. So I'd wanted to ask that question to kind of set the stage a little bit because, as I mentioned, we, in some regards, put the cart before the horse a little bit. Because if some of you have not heard of Citrix before, you may not have the faintest clue what it was that we were actually showing you there. So I'm going to take some time here in this section to go ahead and illustrate a few things for you. So for starters, if we take a look at Citrix as a company, we're actually not unlike a lot of you, I would imagine, in that we've been an enterprise organization that's been around for a long time, has a lot of history and a lot of infrastructure of our own, history of products and acquisitions that we've been dealing with over time. But we were founded around this idea of taking originally the OS/2 operating system, turning it into a multi-user operating system, which it wasn't at the time, and allowing people to connect into that remotely. So that whole concept of taking platforms and making them kind of mainframe-like, if you will, giving you the ability to connect to them remotely, is kind of where the organization started. And that goes back into 1991 was about the time that the first product was launched. And over time, Citrix has evolved substantially. So we're all about remote access for many, many, many years. And somewhere around the 2006 timeframe, actually backing it up, so remote access primarily to Windows applications. That's really where the bulk of the growth in our organization and our business came from. So it was around 2006 that we actually introduced some best-of-breed networking technologies in our application delivery controllers. And then moving forward, you see a bit more of the transition that we've made across time. And I'm not going to touch on all of these in the instance of time, but kind of the place that we've landed ultimately, and we're still at today, we've got this capability or this vision of the Citrix Secure Workspace that I'm going to chat with you a little bit about today. So one common theme here is that with all the different spaces that we've been, as we've been evolving dramatically alongside the IT industry over time, one thing that's been kind of a common thread of what we've been doing is that we've always been trying to lead the future of work. So let me describe that a little bit more. So at Citrix, we fundamentally believe that work is something that you do, not some place that you go. And today's technologies actually make that a lot more feasible than they did roll back even 5 years, 10 years, dare I even go back 15 years. And in our current version, and the way that we're building and bringing a product to market, we put people and security at the center of everything it is that we do. So if you think about any given knowledge worker, the next generation, the cloud workers that are coming into the workforce today, or the way that a lot of our knowledge workers are transitioning into more like cloud workers, where they're innovating versus just going along with business as usual. One common scenario that you see is that the users tend to be roaming around, accessing or needing to access their corporate applications and data from a variety of different devices and a variety of different locations. Now, those resources they may be accessing could be stored anywhere today, right? They could be in the cloud. They could be in an on-premises or customer-managed type of a data center, or they could be applications or services that you're consuming from the public cloud. But the key here is that we put the user in the middle of that. Now, kind of stepping forward into the Citrix of today. So we're not the smallest organization. We've been around for quite a few years, right, since the 89 timeframe. So what we're all about today is this whole concept of the intelligent workspace. And the intelligent workspace is really, there are a lot of parallels. If you know and understand the Google Cloud Worker vision and the direction that Google is taking it with the combination of things like Chrome and Chrome Enterprise and the G Suite applications and IAP and a lot of the different services that are available on GCP, our intelligent workspace vision and the products that we're developing and bringing to market today to help make that happen are all about bringing together the apps and information and services that the users need to do their job and to innovate, bringing those to any device that they may have available to them at any point in time over any type of a network that they've got. And so this vision of the intelligent workspace, we make the assumption that the user is going to need to be able to access those resources wherever they happen to be, right? So we take the perimeter that used to be the corporate firewall at your primary data center for an organization, and we're essentially moving that perimeter. Instead of being at the edge of a business or a data center, we're moving that perimeter out around the actual user itself. So Citrix of today, we count over 400,000 customers. Those are customers as in businesses. We don't really have any consumer-facing technologies in the market today. We've got coverage through a large percentage of the Fortune 500, and ultimately we've got over 100 million licensed users out in the market space. So we've grown a heck of a lot, and along the way, as I'd mentioned, we'd historically, probably very similar to you, had been building services and building products that we'd been shipping kind of traditionally, right? So following the old traditional waterfall model, building packaged products that we would then test and put in a box and actually ship people a box. So over time, we've been on a pretty substantial digital transformation of our own, moving our own business away from that model of delivering perpetual products and moving into the delivery of those technologies via services. So you'll hear us talk about this thing called Citrix Cloud today. And I want to ensure you that this is not an IaaS. You're not going to go buy some compute and some networking and some storage from us. So Citrix Cloud is our platform that we leverage to deliver all these innovative services to our customers. So this platform is cloud-based. We're doing all the similar types of things with rapid iteration and release cycles and canarying of releases and all those kinds of things that you're probably also dealing with. But with this cloud-based platform, we're pre-integrating the services. So you can consume multiple different services on their own to solve point problems, or you can consume multiple services together, and the platform itself integrates those services and saves you from a lot of the work. then we're also with the platform managing and maintaining and upgrading, keeping evergreen all the components that go into the solution. But one point I'll make here is that Citrix has a lot of experience from our digital transformation. One kind of unique thing that we've been doing is taking those experiences and our lessons learned and rolling those into features and capabilities of our cloud platform. So one of the things that we pride ourselves on is providing apps and services via Citrix Cloud that help our enterprise customers with their digital transformation journeys, right? Meet them on their way, on their journey, and help add some value and help them get more of the value out of digital transformation. So I'm not going to touch on all these points here, but I just want to point out a couple key things. For starters, if you recognize that date of 2011, that was the launch of Chrome and the Chrome OS and Chromebooks. Right? So Citrix was actually one of the launch partners, one of the key partners. So we brought, at the time, it was our Citrix receiver, we brought to market. And that allowed organizations to adopt Chromebooks for their end user access. And it gave the business and IT a way to deliver their, call them legacy today, applications like Windows applications and Linux-based applications, deliver those down to Chromebooks. So we've seen a lot of success. And if you look over the years, the main thing I want you to pick out from this is the velocity of innovation. So especially as you get into the last 3 years, you'll see that the velocity of innovation and the co-investment on both sides of this alliance has been substantial. And you're going to continue to see a lot more of that evolve as time goes. So very quickly, the ecosystem of solutions that we provide here, kind of the center, if you will, of the user experience is this thing called the Citrix Workspace, the Workspace platform. It's accessed through this thing called the Citrix Workspace app, which is either a web browser or it's a native app across all different types of platforms. And it's kind of that common consumption point or aggregation point of those virtualized Windows apps as being one of the types of services. But we're also delivering things like SaaS-based applications, doing single sign-on to those things, wrapping a bunch of advanced analytics and security services around those. And here very recently, well, very recently being the last year and a half or so, we've also substantially stepped up the capabilities to deploy virtualized apps and desktops on GCP. So pulling this back around to that demo that we started with. So that demo that we started with was showing you an automated, very simple way to get started deploying virtualized applications and desktops on GCP. But the key point I want to make there is that Citrix is not just about virtualized apps and desktops. We still do that a lot. However, we've got a lot more services and capabilities available in the marketplace today. So the solution areas that you'll find us working together on, you can see kind of a quick snapshot of here. So in the productivity and workspace area, if you're using G Suite and the Workspace app, we provide our content collaboration capabilities that snap into G Suite in the Workspace. We provide this advanced access control that if you want to, you can come check out in the booth and we'll show you off some of that stuff. On the far right, we're talking about our endpoint management capabilities, which are built into Citrix Cloud. And those integrate and work very well with both Chrome Enterprise and with Android Enterprise, Android for Work. And then finally, if you're in the GCP world, if that's kind of where your technology focus is, and where we're going to spend the bulk of the rest of our time here in this session, then you're leveraging GCP to deploy our virtual apps and desktops, also some of our networking technologies and appliances. And that's the area that we're going to be focusing on for the rest of the afternoon session. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague here, Rich Meesters, to take us through a little bit more depth. Take us away, Jim.
Thanks, Rick. Watch where the mic goes, I guess. So what I want to do is delve a little bit further down into the architectural components of Citrix virtual apps and desktops on GCP. We did talk about, Rick has gone through what Citrix Cloud was, what the Workspace is. Really, it's a bunch of services, cloud-delivered services, that wrap around this whole Workspace experience. A lot of these will come into play in that Citrix Google ecosystem in terms of delivering an overall service to your customers. But what we want to focus on is really those items that we're dealing with in the demo. And fundamentally there, what we're looking at is, what Jeff started building at the beginning of the session, and the focus of the components that we're putting on Google Cloud is really the virtual apps and desktop services. And then we're going to front end that with the workspace and the workspace experience from an end user experience perspective coming off the Chromebook. So what is the Citrix virtual apps and desktop services? I think Rick, kind of covered it. It's really the foundation of what we've been doing at Citrix for the last approximately 30 years. And that is deploying Windows workloads and now Linux workloads in a centralized location, whether that's on a customer premise or in a public cloud like GCP, and then allowing users to access those applications in a secure fashion. So the Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktop service itself is really the cloud-hosted control plane, and that's Citrix managed component. So that's the glue that holds all of the infrastructure together, as well as workloads that our customers put in their data centers wherever they may want to put them. So in their data centers, in public cloud, pretty much wherever they want to put them. And then the users access those applications using the Workspace app anywhere, anytime from any device that they want to access them from. The key components here that we'll start to kind of break down and talk about, the Citrix connectors, they're the component that provide that link between customers, GCP, resource location, and the Citrix Cloud Control Plane, as well as the VDAs, which is the agent, or what we call a virtual delivery agent, that we install on the virtual desktops or the Windows server, the Linux server, to provide access to the applications on them. So in terms of what components we actually require, our minimal set is we need a couple of Citrix Cloud connectors, and those are Windows Server instances, and the virtual delivery agents. So those agents running on those Windows or Linux instances to deliver the applications. Other components that we require, Active Directory is required for a Citrix system. All of our Windows machines are domain joined. And so you absolutely have to have Active Directory in your environment, but in many customer situations from a security perspective, they don't at least initially want to put Active Directory controllers into a public cloud infrastructure. So really what we need is the service. Other optional components that we have within the environment, we have SMB file shares for Windows user profiles. We have our Citrix ADCs or gateways. And those are, we'll talk a little bit more about what the ADC does, but it's part of our access tier infrastructure, as well as storefront. We've talked about the workspace and workspace experience. Some customers opt to go with our older version of that, which is storefront, and then they can build that within their own infrastructure and control the routing of their traffic through those infrastructures. And finally, federated authentication and certificate services are components that allow us to federate SAML-based authentication into our Active Directory components. So these are other additional components that we'll talk a little bit about as we go through the reference architectures. So the cloud connectors, as we said, they really provide that glue or that layer in between the customer's environment and the Citrix managed control plane. And they're there to provide services to support the connection between those two components. We do say we want to have two connectors in every resource location that we have. These connectors are Citrix managed components. So we will reach down to those components, or when they reach up to us, we'll check their version and we will update them periodically. So we want to have a minimum of 2 of those in any resource location so we maintain high availability. We also want to put these connectors in different availability zones within GCP so that we can tolerate, again, we get higher levels of availability and tolerate failures, potential failures within a zone. Within that component, there's multiple services that are running. The Secure Ticket Authority is used by the gateway to ensure that communications are secure between the front end, user end, and the back end. Gateway services, if we're using the gateway in the cloud, provides that path for the traffic from the workload to the user's endpoint to transit. Brokering is it's kind of its primary function is just to make sure that users are getting access to the resources they need, as well as provisioning services, and we'll talk a little bit about machine creation services later, which allow us to do single instance management and managing the identity. So Citrix does not maintain the customer's Active Directory in our control plane. Customer maintains that on their own resource location, and the identity service within the connector will manage that. Typically, what we see with these are usually 4 vCPUs and 12 to 16 gigabytes of RAM. And the communication from the connector is a TLS 1.2 outbound only connection to the Citrix control plane. The Windows Virtual Delivery Agent, this is the component that sits on top of the workloads, and it connects the Windows and Linux instances to the Virtual Apps and Desktop service. It's a software package that's installed on that server or desktop instance, and it basically communicates with the connectors on TCP port 80 to register itself with the system, and also communicates out to the end users outbound with TCP 1494 or 2598 natively. And often that is done through a gateway service where that is then encapsulated in 443. Now, one of the important points when you're looking at your infrastructure is the scalability. Most of your infrastructure that you build in a Citrix environment is going to be workload. We have a few connector servers, we'll have some storefront, potentially some federated authentication services, but you're really only talking about a handful of servers at that point. So your majority is going to be either virtual desktops or Windows servers that are publishing apps. And because of that, scalability of these plays a major part in looking at your design. For VDI, it's really simple. It's kind of picking out the best instance type that you might have for your workload. For server-based computing, then we want to look at single instance scalability within GCP to understand how many users can we get on a given workload. And Citrix did last year some baseline scalability testing. We used login VSI, and we worked through several iterations of various instance types in GCP. And what we found at that time was the best instance type that we had, or instance size that we had, was the N1 standard 8 for the workloads, for XenApp workloads, for server-based computing workloads. And we ran about 33 users per VM on that, using a standardized knowledge worker workload in login VSI. Other considerations here, you want to look at optimizing your costs through discounts. So of course, if you're familiar with GCP, you know that by default, something that GCP has that other cloud providers don't have are the sustained use discounts. So taking a look at how you discount your environment based on VMs running over a period of time. And there's a good amount of detail here that I'm not going to go into. But also the committed use discount, which is more, I guess, a traditional discounting you'll see across cloud providers, where you have 1 and 3 year commitments where you pay a certain amount and then you run those workloads 100% of the time. Certainly for some of the control element workloads that you may put in your resource location, this is a really good idea to take a look at because you know they're going to be running 100% of the time. But we also want to take a look at it from a perspective of what does it mean for running workloads? And Jeff was good enough to put this graph together for us as we did some of our architecture discussions to kind of take a look at the breakpoints here for sustained and committed use discounts. So the green is the standard sustained use and how it increases over time. The blue curve is a 3-year committed use, and the purple curve is a 1-year committed use. So what you see here where those lines intersect is really the point at which it starts to make sense to consider those committed use discounts for your workloads. For instance, here, if your 50% of your workload is going to be running 100% of the time, or if you're running your workload for 50% of the time over a month, then you want to start to consider looking at committed use discounts. The other thing to consider for those workloads that aren't going to be using committed use is our Autoscale technology. And this is a technology that Citrix has developed within the product that allows us to take our workloads and dynamically power manage them based on schedule and load. So we can define within our configurations within Citrix when machines should be started up based on a schedule. So Monday to Friday, 8 to 5, you should have X number of machines running. Overnight, you should have X minus 5. On weekends, you should have X minus 10. And we can also then bundle that in with load-based for our server-based computing and saying when our load exceeds a certain point, then I'm going to start to scale up additional machines. Finally, the Citrix ADC on GCP. So this is our application delivery controller, and that is our what we used to call NetScaler. Names have changed recently. The functionality that we have in that we're primarily looking at when we're doing Citrix on GCP are using it as an ICA proxy gateway as opposed to using the gateway services, and that's when customers want to bring their own routing into play. So they don't want to route through the internet; they want to route in and out of their GCP resource locations individually to control traffic, as well as load balancing for components if we put storefront in place, for instance, and potentially content switching as well. We do support single and multi-NIC configurations in that, so we can define our topology from a network perspective and understand how our communications are going to happen within our VNets. And we can deploy it today as standalone instances. They're not yet available in the store, right? So we have them as a download, and then there's a step-by-step deployment, the URL here, as well as some deployment manager scripts to get those going. On the horizon, what we're looking at, really, these are things that we're looking at coming out with this year and into next year. Machine creation services, and that allows us to, right now we can power manage machines within GCP, but what we want to do is get into being able to have a single instance management across a number of machines, so we can manage a single OS application package and then deploy it to multiple machines. Having native Google ID support in, in Citrix Workspace. So rather than having to log on with Active Directory credentials, being able to log on directly with your Google ID, as well as SD-WAN on GCP. And there was an announcement today about that. SD-WAN on GCP will be available within the store coming up in 1 month. And SD-WAN is used for software-defined networking and setting up paths between branches and data centers, having multiple redundant paths and logic and how you switch between them. And as well on the ADC side, we have some enhancements coming up primarily around HA, having multiple ADCs and being able to manage them, as well as, again, integrating those into the marketplace. So with that, let me turn it back over to Jeff, and we'll do a walkthrough of the reference architecture.
Thanks, Rich. So what we're going to do, take these pieces of the architecture that Rich just told us about, the cloud connectors, the VDA, et cetera, and we're going to explore, basically this is kind of a simple reference architecture, similar to actually what's being built by the scripts. And we're going to look at a couple of workflows to explore what each architectural component is doing in those workflows. So the first one we're going to look at is what happens when a user logs in to the Citrix Workspace. So it starts on the user's device, whether it's a laptop, a tablet, phone, whatever. For whatever operating system, there are native Citrix Workspace apps. There's also an HTML5 Workspace app that you can access in the browser. And so the user will access the Citrix Workspace and log in. Now that login request goes up to Citrix Cloud. Citrix Cloud doesn't authenticate the user directly. Citrix Cloud actually delegates that authentication to the Active Directory that's installed in the GCP environment. And so it does that by communicating with those cloud connectors, right? It passes along that authentication request through the cloud connectors, which actually then authenticate the user against the Active Directory domain controllers. Those Active Directory domain controllers may be standalone domain controllers like they are in the demo environment that our scripts are building, but more often than not, it's some kind of a, maybe a replication scenario where an on-prem Active Directory is being replicated into the cloud, or there's some kind of trust relationship set up there. But once those domain controllers authenticate the user, they'll pass back through the cloud connector the authentication results. Citrix Cloud will then say, okay, I know who this user is. Now, Citrix Cloud makes an authorization decision. What does that user have access to? That's part of the control plane functionality that exists in Citrix Cloud. So it'll decide what virtual apps, what virtual desktops does that user have access to, and then it will render in the workspace, a menu that allows the user to choose from one of the apps or desktops that they have access to. So then the next workflow we want to look at is what happens then when a user chooses a virtual app, and how does that app get launched, and how does that all work? So again, we're starting here. The users are then going to say, click on Notepad. I want to run Notepad and as a virtual app. So that request will go up through Citrix Cloud, and Citrix Cloud is going to then make a decision. There's a load balancing decision here, because this is a fleet of servers being used by a group of users, and we have to allocate a session on one of those servers. These are the VDAs. We have to make an allocation decision. This is a session brokering and management capabilities of Citrix Cloud. So it'll say, okay, well, this Notepad session, I'm going to allocate that on one of my available VDA servers. Now it's going to pass that session initialization information into the VDA, again, through the cloud connectors. And then the cloud connector will pass that along to the VDA. The VDA will actually then log in as the user, launch Notepad, and then initialize that user's virtual app session. This is that ICA traffic. Rich talked about ICA proxies. Now, by default, that ICA traffic is going to stream from the VDA server directly to Citrix Cloud. If there's connectivity between the VDA and Citrix Cloud, it's going to go through the gateway service of Citrix Cloud and then back to the end user device. Now, if the VDA can't communicate directly with Citrix Cloud, it'll proxy that traffic through the cloud connectors. So there's some path decisions being made here. But assuming that VDA can communicate with Citrix Cloud, it's going to stream that ICA traffic through the gateway service of Citrix Cloud and then back to that end user, who then is going to see Notepad running on their device. And that's basically what we'll demo at the end of the session. Now, that was a quick walkthrough of sort of a reference architecture. And now Rick is going to join me, and we're going to actually walk through a couple of real-world architectures, maybe how we adapted them, how they're a little bit similar to, but in some ways different than the reference architecture we just looked at.
Yeah, so one thing that you'll find about Citrix technologies and about Citrix Cloud is that they're cloud services, right? So there's a lot of flexibility in what you consume, how you want to consume it. We can leverage technologies to tie the services together from an automation standpoint, build those services. So you actually have a lot of flexibility in what you can do, what you can actually build with it. So I'll give you a little bit of a pitch to come down and check out the booth later on, because we've got a couple of interesting use cases we built there. So what we wanted to share with you to start off with, this first customer, I'm not going to dive too deeply into it, because we've actually got a public case study that'll be out there very, very shortly on this. This case study is very representative of a lot of traditional Citrix customers. So they've been a Citrix customer for some time. And they're facing a lot of the similar type of IT challenges that you may be facing as you're making your transition to the cloud at your organization. So they'd had Citrix in place for a long time. They've been forced to deal with and come up with ways that they can consume cloud-based services to make them more efficient and more agile as an IT team. And they're also under some pressure to reduce the costs of running their own data centers. So they made some decisions to move some of their workloads up into the cloud. In the process, they decided to start to consume our cloud-delivered services. And ultimately, what they've ended up getting out of this is a system that's much more functional than what they've got. They're able now to deliver SaaS-based apps and mobile apps and such alongside their Windows-based apps. They've got consumption-based pricing of the infrastructure, and they're offloading a lot of the management efforts both onto Citrix and onto Google, which allows them to deliver better services more quickly. So I'll leave it on that, and then I want to touch on one here that I don't have a customer name to share for you here. But this use case is a little bit different in that, one, it's education, but I think you'll see some relative parallels here. So in this case, we'd had a school system that had been teaching their students heavyweight applications like CAD, like the AutoCAD suite. And the way they'd been doing that traditionally is by investing in these big monstrous workstations, and they put these workstations onto these mobile carts that they would roll around room to room. And then as they would have X number of students, they'd roll the carts into a room, fire those things up, and do their thing. Well, half the time, those things ended up just sitting there doing nothing when they're not in class, and they paid for them all up front. And then, of course, over time, those things become antiquated and need to be replaced, which was the driving force behind this engagement with us. So what they ultimately ended up doing was leveraging GCP, our Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops, and also leveraging NVIDIA's GPU instances that you can run out on GCP. So they're now running these apps out of a GCP location near. They're paying for AutoCAD, actually not AutoCAD, they own AutoCAD, but they're paying for their consumption of both GPU and compute based on usage. So it ends up being substantially less expensive for them. And they're now able to logistically just have the students use whatever device they happen to bring in and run those things. So real quickly, so I leave some room for Jeff here, the architecture that was deployed for these guys actually is very similar to the one that you see popping out the back end of this automation tooling. So it was all very similar. The one difference from the reference architecture that Jeff shared with you earlier is that the instances, instead of just being the general purpose instances, they're actually instances with NVIDIA GPUs and their virtual data, VDWS. I always stumble on what that acronym stands for. But they're basically GPU accelerated instances that run up inside of Citrix Cloud, or excuse me, GCP. They're also leveraging Citrix gateways at the perimeter of GCP. And the reason they did that is because they wanted to have the absolute best possible performance. So they got their users closest to the nearest GCP region. They've got their gateways there as well. So they've got the utmost of performance of the pipe, the lowest possible latency, and they've also got the fullest featured protocol stack in the midst of it. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand over to this last one.
So this next customer, was a public sector organization with a mission-critical multi-tier app. Some of their challenges, they had a heavy database interactions. They're trying to move to the cloud, but they're having trouble because if they moved the application away from the database, they weren't getting great performance. They have a distributed workforce, so around the country, they all needed to access this application, and they weren't getting consistent, performance. And they'd also invested in an on-prem multi-factor authentication scheme using smart cards, and they needed, even in the cloud, they needed to authenticate their users against this smart card infrastructure. So the solution was to move the application and the database into Google Cloud so that the chatty application was close to the database in Google Cloud, leveraging the Google global network for distributing this application using Citrix Virtual Apps to their distributed workforce. And the unique thing about our configuration was that we set up federated authentication against that on-prem identity provider, so they could leverage their existing infrastructure to authenticate users. So again, it's similar to the architecture we already looked at. A couple of differences. One, you'll notice that the client devices don't initially talk to the Citrix Cloud when they authenticate users. Now they're configured, the gateway is actually running on an appliance in GCP. And this gives you a lot more flexibility to how you configure that appliance. Here, it's then it's configured not to authenticate against a local Active Directory domain controller, but instead using SAML to use that on-prem identity provider, which allowed this customer to leverage the smart cards to do their authentication. And then, once the users are authenticated, then the workflow is similar to what we looked at earlier. All right, so we've got a few minutes left. Let's hop back to our laptop and take a look at our demo environment, see if it built happily and if we have something that we can take a look at. So they deployed 4 instances. The Cloud Connector, the CC is a Cloud Connector we've been talking about. The DC is a domain controller, an Active Directory domain controller. The third one, which is shut down now, we called it management. It really was just a script runner. It ran the scripts that actually configured Citrix Cloud, right? So once it was done, there was nothing else to do, so it shuts itself down the way we've set up this deployment. And then the XA, that's the VDA server right there. And so this is that simple architecture we looked at, where we've got a Cloud Connector, the domain controller, and a small VDA fleet. Now, if you want to log into this environment that's been set up for you, one thing that you have to do is acquire some user credentials. We've pre-populated the Active Directory domain with some sample users. And so there's a PowerShell script in that same directory that we were in before called get domain users. And what it will do is it will reach out to Google Cloud Storage. Now, first it's going to ask us which deployment do we want to retrieve these users for, because you can actually have multiple of these sample deployments running in your project. The one we just ran is number 5 here. It's going to reach out to Google Cloud Storage and retrieve an encrypted blob where we have stored the usernames and passwords of some sample users. And then it's going to decrypt that blob using our KMS service. So we've stored that not in plain text, but as an encrypted blob. And here we can see the usernames and passwords. So let's just say we're going to log in as user 5. I'm copying that password for user 5, and we can bring up the Citrix Workspace. And fingers crossed, we should be able to say we want to log in as user_5@example.org and paste that password in. And that Citrix Workspace, now remember, this is going to Citrix Cloud through the Cloud Connector against our Active Directory domain controller. We're successfully logged in now. If we go look at View All Apps, we should see Notepad was set up. We are authorized to use the virtual app Notepad. And if we click on that, that again should send that request to initialize the session through our Cloud Connectors, through Citrix Cloud, do the session brokering through the Cloud Connector to launch the session on the VDA. Here we see it's logging in, and momentarily what we should see on a Chromebook now is a window that pops up to let us access our Windows app, which is Notepad. And this environment, it was built again, hands-off, took about 22 minutes or so if you run those scripts. So if you switch back to the slides. All that's out on GitHub for you, and we invite you to check it out. Google Cloud Platform /Citrix on GCP, and we love pull requests. So if you like hacking on code, if you come up with some way to improve the deployment scripts, you want to contribute back, please reach out to us through the GitHub project.
All right. So let's take it home and wrap this up, shall we? So one thing I hope you gathered from this session today is that you at least got a taste of the fact that Citrix is about a lot more than just virtualized apps and desktops. So I'd encourage you to come take a look at the Citrix booth. We're down the expo floor. We're showing some kind of unique and innovative use cases there, but we can talk to you about any of the different services that are available. But in the booth, you'll see how we've got our Citrix Workspace family of subscriptions, our Citrix Networking family, and Citrix Analytics, and we can give you a much better feel for how all those things come together and provide this thing called the Secure Digital Workspace. So one quick call to action is if you've got a digital transformation project on the horizon, keep us in mind. The combination of the two technologies do a great job of taking the world that you're living in today, bridging that into the cloud world, and helping you get there at a much higher speed and velocity and gain the value and the benefits back out of it. I gave you some wrap-up links here to the different automation frameworks that we've got out there. So, there's no reason aside from I don't happen to have a project that I could get into, a GCP project. All you need is a GCP project and a trial subscription to Citrix Cloud. Grab that code, and you can have a bunch of fun. So I pointed out our booth. Come down and visit us. We'll show you some pretty cool use cases down there. Partners, if there's any partners in the room. I will point out that we are actually looking for some very cloud-forward, cloud-first thinking types of partners. And the combination of building a practice around Google plus Citrix is a great way to differentiate your business today.